You know that feeling when you come across something that is just entirely unexpected, especially when you're kind of looking for something similar and all of a sudden it hits you like that cartoon rake that you step on right in the middle of the forehead. I had an experience like that recently, and I'm really, really excited to share it with you. If you are new to the channel, my name is White Cross. You can call me Dubsy, you can call me White. I answer to pretty much anything. And if you haven't yet subscribed to this channel, I would love to have you be part of this community. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you are one of my returning subscribers, I want to thank you guys in particular because this is a really exciting journey and I'm going to take you along with it. Let me know what you think about it. So excited to share this one with you. If you are new to the channel, I like to begin each of my videos with a simple disclaimer, and that disclaimer is that I am not a financial advisor. I'm not trying to offer you any kind of financial advice. I'm simply trying to share some of my experience having bought and sold precious metals and rare coins for the last 30 or 40 years. I also like to begin each of my videos with a couple of concepts, if I can, to kind of work back into the subject matter that we're talking about. So this subject that we're talking about is an exciting bullion find, and I'm going to get into that, but let's talk about a few concepts first. The first one is ABL. That's just an acronym that I use, a series of letters to remind myself to always be learning. And if you've ever seen the movie Glengarry Glen Ross, you might remember the scene where Alec Baldwin is approaching the grizzled group of salespeople in the bullpen, and he's essentially telling them that they're all going to get fired unless they start producing. And then he flips this chalkboard over and he has the letters ABC written there. That stands for always be closing. And he's trying to convince them that they need to work harder to produce. And I've actually used ABC a lot in my professional life. I love that scene. It speaks to me. And it's a fantastic movie. If you haven't seen it, take a look at it. But I like to adapt that to ABL. Always be learning. Always be learning about the things that are important in your life. And one of the things that is easiest for me to do is to learn about things that I'm passionate about. And maybe you feel the same way. You know, watching a video like this, I hope, is part of your ABL experience. I hope that you are learning by watching these videos. It's one of the primary reasons that I'm making them, but it's something that impacts me in my normal everyday life too. I don't like having to do homework, but if something inspires me, something I find exciting or interesting, it's really easy for me to go down those rabbit holes and learn about it. So that's kind of what I'm encouraging. If it's something that you feel passionate about, push yourself to really learn about it. Because for me, at least, it's always easy to learn about something that you are passionate about instead of something that you kind of feel like you have to learn about. ABL, always be learning. So that's the first concept I wanted to share with you. The second one's a little bit more dry, and that one is the idea of seigniorage. Seigniorage is a word that we come across in the coin collecting community a little bit more often than we do in the bullion community. And seigniorage is kind of a strange, very specific word. And what it really relates to is the difference between the cost of producing money. And this was really something that we saw when precious metals were used as circulating currency more than we do today. We still use seigniorage today. The difference between the cost of producing money and the money's value as it enters circulation. That's called seigniorage. And let me just give you an example. A modern American quarter, a 25-cent piece, cost about 11 cents to produce. So that includes all of the minting costs, the personnel costs, the labor, everything else, and the materials. But as soon as that 11-cent coin hits circulation, it's worth 25 cents. So this is a way that governments have for probably thousands of years have made money. It's by the fact that the value of the coins that they are making is usually greater than the precious metals or even the non-precious metals from which they are made. That does apply to paper currency as well. But the nice thing about that is that it's kind of a de facto tax, and that these funds that the government has are theoretically used to improve the society that the government rules over without having to actually tax the consumers, without having to tax its citizens. So seigniorage can be a good thing as long as that money is directed towards positive things. You can also have negative seigniorage, and if you're not aware, it actually costs us nearly 3 cents now to make every one of our 1-cent coins. So that actually costs us more money than the coins are worth. You know, that has a lot to do with the powers that be that run the zinc and the copper mines in this country and elsewhere. And until we have the ability to overcome those powerful interests, we will probably continue to pump out these cents that cost us more than a cent to make. That's negative seigniorage, but you get the idea. Seigniorage is the amount of kind of profit over making a coin. We'll talk about seigniorage a little bit later in this video. So those are just some concepts to work into it. I promise we're going to get to a really exciting find, one of my most important, probably the most important piece of bullion that I will ever pick up. But I wanted to give you a little bit of background first before we get into it. If you are one of the long-term stackers, especially for gold, you know that there is hype around pre-33 gold. What does that mean? So gold coins used to be what we circulated. That was what we spent in this country all the way up until 1933. We spent gold coins, denominations from $1 all the way up to, well, technically $50, but most often encountered would have been a $20 piece. So $1 gold piece, a $2.50, a $3, a $4, a $5, $10, and a $20 gold piece. This was the larger currency that we used in this country up until 1933. What happened in 1933? We were in the Great Depression, and we were throwing anything at the wall to try to get us out of that Great Depression. And one of the things that the president did, that was President Roosevelt at the time, he issued Executive Order 6102. That was in April of 1933. And it's commonly used in the stacking community to say that we outlawed gold ownership. That's not true. It's actually pretty far from the truth. What Executive Order 6102 did was to call in gold certificates. All of our paper money at the time was tied to gold, directly to gold on deposit at the Treasury. So we weren't able to inflate our currency to try to spend ourselves out of depression. We were limited to the amount of gold that we had in the Treasury. So Roosevelt called in all of the gold that was out there, including gold that was in private hands. Now, this was really designed to call in gold bullion and those gold certificates so that we could get ourselves off of the gold standard and start printing more money. I know a lot of people say that that's a terrible idea. You could argue either way, and I think some of the historical facts seem to show that maybe it worked. I'll let you be the judge of that. But individuals could still own gold jewelry. They could own rare gold coins and coin collections, anything that was kind of considered numismatic gold. And each American could still own up to $100 face value in gold. Now, you have to remember that a $20 gold piece at the time, that would likely have been a St. Gaudens gold piece, was worth $20 and had almost exactly 1 full troy ounce of gold in it. So if you could own $100 in gold, and the way that the executive order is written, it seems to say that every American, so I'm going to include minors along with it, could own up to 5 troy ounces of gold in the form of then circulating gold coins. That's a pretty heavy amount of gold. Not many Americans own 5 ounces of gold now. But if you had a wife or a spouse and you had kids, each one of them could theoretically also own that much gold. So you're talking about a fair amount of gold, right? This is certainly not illegal to own. It was really designed to pull in those gold certificates and really designed to pull in gold bullion. So that's what Executive Order 6102 was. But did you know that there was an Executive Order 6814 that came a year later? I know these sound a little bit dry, but they get into some really interesting things when it comes to precious metals. 6814 was issued about a year later, and that called in silver. So a lot of people don't realize that all of the silver bullion was also being called in by the government. Now, that gets a little bit more dicey, but we don't talk about it quite as often. And I think one of the reasons we don't is because this was really to call in silver bullion so that it could be turned into silver coins, like this examples of these peace dollars from this period of time. So the silver that you had, if it was in the form of bullion, and we're talking probably more of an industrial or investment purpose. This is specifically excluded anything that had never really been considered bullion. So that was foreign and domestic silver coins. You could still own them, presumably in any amount that you wanted to. So that could be taken to be thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in silver coins. And any kind of silver jewelry or silverware, silver mugs, silver plates, all that kind of stuff, that was never really considered to be bullion. And anything less than 800 fine, which would be probably a lot of European type silver artwork and that kind of thing. So this was really designed to call in silver bullion so that it could be coined into coins and to produce more money so that we could spend more and borrow more and lend more, again, to try to get us out of the Great Depression. But 6814 also mandated that for every ounce of silver that you turned into the government, this is a troy ounce, you were to be paid $1.29 for your silver. But the government was going to keep 61 and 8/25% as seigniorage. There's that word again. So in other words, the government would take your silver, would pay you $1.29, but they were only going to pay you 32% of it back. This is a pretty substantial amount of seigniorage. That's really where the problem, I think, comes in. But you could argue that this was something the government had to do. That amount of seigniorage sounds pretty excessive. What happens, and the government actually said specifically that they would pay you back for your silver in the form of silver coins, and you could take them in any form that you wanted to. Presumably that means dimes, quarters, halves, and silver dollars. You could also be paid in silver certificates. I wonder what happens if you had pure silver bars. This was, again, recalling silver bullion, so it seems that that would be pretty much specifically silver bars. What if you had larger sized silver bars and they were 99.9% pure, that millesimal fineness of 0.999 pure? And you were forced to turn that in, and your only recourse was to get that back in the form of 90% pure silver coins at the time. That seems like, insult to injury, throwing salt on the wound. That doesn't really seem fair. And while the government is fine taking a fair amount of your money in this circumstance, it doesn't seem fair that they would pay you back in less than pure silver if that's what you had turned into the mint. Keep that in mind. I think that plays a role in what we're going to be discussing a little bit later. For better or for worse, Executive Order 6814 was recalled in, I believe, 1938. So this didn't happen for very long, but there was a window, a specific period of time where you must turn in bullion in exchange for silver certificates or silver coinage, and the government took a big healthy chunk of that. They also took that tax, if you want to call it that, on transactions of large amounts of silvers going back and forth between the American border and places like Canada and Mexico. So this was a de facto tax on taking silver, and also allowed the government to produce much, much more silver in the form of silver coinage, which allowed them to produce more silver certificates, those pieces of currency. That was all designed to allow greater amounts of lending and borrowing to try to get us out of the Great Depression. 6814. Interesting. That comes hand in hand with a law that came a little bit later, that was Public Law 8836, and that was how silver certificates eventually could be redeemed, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. I wanted to talk a little bit about these pieces that you see here before you, because this is really classic bullion. This is vintage bullion, and I know there are a lot of stackers out there who just don't see the purpose, and I totally get that. There's a mantra that some people use that silver is silver, right? All silver is silver. What difference does it make? You have to remember that I come to precious metals decades ago from having been a numismatist first, so a coin collector. So to me, I'm always looking at those numismatic terms. We're looking for scarcity or rarity. We're looking for condition. We're looking for the small number that were made in the first place. We're looking at how few pieces survive today. We're looking at supply and demand. And there is nothing wrong with stacking silver for silver's sake. If you are, after having hordes of 10-ounce bars made last week, there is nothing wrong with that. And I applaud you for stacking silver in the first place. But I think that you can have something a little bit more interesting if you look for it. And to me, that historical interest, the scarcity, the rarity, the conditions, all of that kind of stuff add a little bit to your stack and make it more interesting. So that's kind of what I have been after for my stacking career for most of it. Let's go back 25 years at least anyway. And I've got here some examples that you've probably seen before if you've watched any of my videos. That's that 50-ounce Sheffield silver bar. Here's 7th and 10th series Inglehart silver bars. Those date, this one probably dates back to the 60s. These probably late 70s, early 80s. And we've got some international vaults and Western States refining bars. Here's that silver, American Silver Company, American Silver Credit bar, one of my most rare bars. So, and this one, I just wanted to show this one really briefly. This is a silver matte bar. This is a really kind of strange little bar that collectors really seem to like. These are incredibly hard to find. So yeah, most of my silver bullion, my silver stack, comes in the form of classic or vintage silver whenever I can find it. That's what I'm drawn towards. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background of why you're looking at this and why this kind of stuff is important to me. Public Law 8836 detailed how to dispose of the silver we held on reserve. So after we got through World War II, after we got through all of the trials and tribulations of the Great Depression, it turned out that the price of silver was inching higher and higher, and it didn't make a lot of sense for us to continue to have silver. Really, people stopped seeing it as the kind of currency that we had been used to for 1,000 years in favor of new paper currency. That seemed to be where we were going. Everybody knows that stacked silver, that we kind of took silver out of our circulation in 1964, no longer in circulation as of 1965, with the exception of those 40% half dollars that circulated for a little bit later. But if you're old enough to remember, and I admit that I'm not quite this old, there was a brief window starting in 1964 where the government was trying to decide what to do with its silver, and it had massive silver reserves. So the concept was to call in all of the silver certificates. If you've ever seen a silver certificate, that was what our currency was following 1933, and it kind of went back a little bit further than that as well. Once we got off the gold standard, we had paper currency that we called silver certificates. And originally, each silver certificate was tied to a silver dollar. You can see how that kind of limited production. But then it just came to represent a dollar's worth of silver, whatever the market was showing. So silver certificates look a lot like the small size $1 bills that we have now. Those are Federal Reserve notes. But before those, we had silver certificates. And in 1964, with us going off of having silver in our coinage, the government had a mandate. They were supposed to exchange silver certificates for silver on demand. So you can see that this was going to be a little bit of a problem. What was the government going to do? So Public Law 8836 really kind of detailed how to get rid of the silver that we had in reserve, to call in the rest of the silver certificates, to start printing Federal Reserve notes. I know this is a sore point also for a lot of stackers. They feel like, if our money isn't tied to a precious metals, then what value does it have? That's the definition of a fiat currency. I understand that argument completely. In 1964, we decided we were going to start exchanging the last of the silver certificates for the silver that we had. The problem was that eventually those silver dollars, and that's probably what most people were paid for their silver certificates, that's kind of the idea originally, we ran out of those. So the government was forced to start producing silver that they could exchange for these silver certificates. And one of the ways that they did that was to pay out silver granules. Now, I'm sure there's a logical reason why they did that. Granules, literally like grains of sand almost, that were exchanged for silver certificates. And originally that was 0.773 of a troy ounce. And I've seen examples of small plastic baggies with writing on them. That was one of the ways that people were able to redeem these silver certificates. I've also seen some examples of kind of craft paper envelopes almost. It seems kind of strange and crude, and I'm not exactly sure why. I think maybe the reason is we had so much silver in our inventories that was not coined yet. So it was difficult to kind of pay out coinage for these silver certificates. So the next logical thing was to pay out these granules. If you've got better ideas, let me know. So people lined up at whatever the redemption sites were, and they turned in their silver certificates in exchange for these little baggies of silver granules. And there are aftermarket examples of where you can find kind of attractive plaques that show what a silver certificate looked like, what the granules look like. These are all aftermarket. The mint didn't make these. These were what people did with some of these granules that they had gotten from redemption. They're kind of attractive. I think they're kind of neat. I'm not usually a fan of something that's not an official mint product, but some of these look really cool. I've seen some of these before. I've come across some of them before. Unfortunately, I never bought any of them. So if you've got one of these, I think that's really cool. Congratulations. Those are neat looking. I'll show some pictures. But what happens if you had a lot of silver certificates? there were people that clearly had tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in silver certificates. They wanted to get their silver too, and the government had to give it to you. This was a law. This was something that you as a citizen had the right to have. It was your silver. So the government found itself having to produce a bunch of silver bars, and that's what they did. Now, the rush apparently was so strong between 1964 and 1968 when this eventually wore out. I believe that's when it finally ended, June 24th of 68. That the facilities of the United States government, not just the mint, but there were also other facilities that made them, assay offices, some of them affiliated with the mint, some of them not so much, had to produce silver bars. And they were producing so many bars in such a short period of time that a lot of these bars didn't have any defining characteristics on them at all, except for the weight penciled onto them with a grease pencil. That's the only thing that would show up on these silver bars. So there was no stamp on them, there was no weight on them, there was no purity on them, and some of these really had strange weights and strange purities, but as long as the silver was good quality, the government felt that it was, providing the obligation that they had to redeem these silver certificates. And they redeemed these silver certificates in the form of these bars that we call grease bars, and that's really because they had these pencil marks on them that showed the weight on them. And I'll show a couple of examples of them here. Now, I was researching bars that had kind of a greater supply and demand push and pull. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, and I made a video recently about those Manfred Tordello and Brooks Lady Liberty silver bars, and I'll put a link down below to that video that I made recently where I talked about these. These are kind of an iconic bar that came out in the 1980s. Very attractive. This is a very attractive consumer bar, a beautiful design on it, and this was something that people want and still want to this day. These bars command a big premium. The 1 ounce bar is currently selling for close to $100 on eBay. That's a pretty substantial premium, right? And the thing is that we know that these bars were made in excess of 100,000 pieces. I believe it was 127,000 examples of these were made, and yet they still command a premium. Why is that? Well, they are an iconic bar. They are easily recognized. You can flip it over. You can see which of the manufacturers made them. They were made by Engelhard. They were made by Johnson Matthey and a few others. So they have a little bit of a collector base. They are nostalgic. You think of these being back in the 1980s. They've been around for a long time. They just look kind of iconic, but they made so many of them that it's kind of strange that they still command this kind of premium. And I wanted to compare and contrast that with these grease bars. These grease bars were made by the United States government, right? So you think there'd be a little bit more of a demand for them. Compare a rare coin to a silver round, right? And there's a little bit more demand for something that's made by the US government. I thought the grease bars were a great example of how something could be scarce, because we don't think that many of these grease bars survive today. They didn't survive those mass meltings that I talk about all the time in the early 1980s when the price of silver shot way up. Everything that wasn't nailed down was going into those crucibles to create those big 1,000-ounce 99 pure London good delivery bars. That was what was actually being traded as a global commodity on global silver markets. Nobody wanted strange 105-ounce bars, 110-ounce bars of strange purity. That didn't do anything for anybody. Really, it was those big London good delivery bars that people wanted. So even though these grease bars, as we call them, had been made by the United States Mint and were approaching 30, 40, 50 years old, they were tossed into the crucible. Not many of them survive. Now compare that with those MTB Lady Liberty bars that command a really big premium. You can see that there's something going on here, and I think it has to do with aesthetics. The looks, the iconic symbol of that Lady Liberty versus just a blank silver bar. I think a lot of collectors would really rather have something that had some character to it, that told a story, and these grease bars just didn't do it. Remember, like I said, they didn't have any characteristics on them at all, except a little writing on them. Now, those grease bars are starting to pick up again. I think that some people are starting to realize that these are truly scarce. The problem that I have with them is that it would be difficult to tell for sure if it was authentic. This was the kind of thing that an ambitious person could cast in their backyard and write on it with a pencil, and you would never really know whether or not this was one of those authentic 1965, 1967 grease bars. But I think enough time has passed and so few of these exist that they are starting to get a little bit more of the respect that they're probably due. So interesting how something that has no characteristics on it all, but can be incredibly scarce, sells for a fraction of these pieces that are beautiful, but are made in the hundreds of thousands. An interesting dichotomy, I think. But the mint, when I was researching these bars for this video, these grease bars, I kept on coming across other bars that had been made by the mint. Now, the mint didn't just start making silver bars in the 1960s for silver redemption. The mint actually probably made silver bars, we think, going back to the 1890s. I think that there's not a lot of evidence of things that existed before, then I wouldn't be surprised if we find some, but we don't really know a lot about these. I think the earliest bar that we really know about is 1892. So that's 100, 120, 125 years old now. We have other examples that date from 1909, and we actually have an example. I'll show an example here that actually shows the date on it. So we know that these were produced late 1800s, early 1900s. We just don't really know a lot about them. And there is one guy who has studied these, one expert in the field. His name is Ken Conaway. And Ken published several articles that I came across while I was looking at the compare and contrast between those MTB bars and those grease bars. So I had been searching for government-produced silver bars. That's really what I wanted to compare it to, and I kept on coming across these articles by Ken. And Ken has studied these silver bars that were made by the United States government going back, he's been doing it for decades. And he has put a lot of time and effort into it, and he's kind of the expert on these, and he's determined that they were, fits and starts of these earlier. But really, the bars that that he's been able to study and examine and to write about began in the 1930s. And he calls those Type 1 bars. So the Type 1 bars minted early 1930s, probably to early 1940s. What happened in the early 1940s? Right, we entered World War II, so that probably put the kibosh on making these. And he's offered a couple of suggestions of why they might have been made. Like I said, we don't really know exactly why these early bars were made. The early bars have a kind of a neat oval hallmark, and I'll show an example of it here. You can see the oval hallmark with the eagle. This is kind of a classic, a Federalist almost looking eagle, and to me it reminds me a lot of the eagle that you see on the back of the capped bust half dollars and those seated Liberty full silver dollars also. And I'll show you kind of a comparison between the two. Let me know what you think. They're not identical, but you can see that one is definitely playing off the other, right? Type 1 bars. Early 1930s to early 1940s, that oval hallmark with a kind of serious, stern-looking eagle on it. And they came in various different sizes. So we think that we have examples going down to about 5 ounces. And then they went up to probably 25, 30, 40 ounces as well. Now, it seems to me that it's possible, and I'm just going to put this out here as a theory, and I think Ken's research kind of backs this up. What if you were one of those people that was abiding by Executive Order 6814 and you had silver bullion and you turned it into the United States Mint, but you didn't want coinage, you didn't want silver dollars, right? And you didn't want paper currency. You had silver bullion for a reason. You had it for whatever reason you needed it, whether it was manufacturing, scientific, or you just had liked investment and you wanted pure silver. So it doesn't seem fair that the government would offer you 90% silver in exchange. And if they just offered you silver certificates, you were going to have to use that silver certificate to buy pure silver if that's what you really needed. So I wonder if it's possible that the government was putting out these silver bars for people that had turned in their silver, but also wanted silver back. Why would they give them these specially made bars? Well, these specially made bars have a stamp on them that shows that this silver had been processed by either the United States Mints or one of their other facilities. So there could be no doubt as to whether or not this silver had been turned in lawfully, right? You were actually abiding by the laws of the country by turning in your silver, and in exchange you were getting silver that had that stamp on it that showed that the silver had been gotten lawfully, legally, that you had paid your seigniorage on it. I think it's an interesting possibility. So that was the Type 1 bar, and these are quite scarce. We don't know for sure why they were made. We don't know how many of them were made. There are different sizes. So the idea of why they were made, I think that's about as logical an example as you can possibly have. Now, I propose that there's at least one other possibility, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. The Type 2 bars. 1946 to 1959, a very similar looking eagle, although it's a little bit more rounded. I hate to use the word cartoonish, it just doesn't look quite as stern as that Type 1 silver bar. These also seem to be minted in larger sizes, so no longer are you finding these few examples of smaller bars. These tend to be 10, 25 ounces and greater. That would be the Type 2 bar up to 1959. Type 3 bar, minted from 1959, we think up into the 1980s even. These ones had a circular hallmark on them, and I'll show an example of one of them here. And I've talked a lot about this Saudi Arabian piece from 1945, so this is kind of that same era. You can see how round this hallmark is, if that's what you want to call it. You can see the circular size of it with a lettering going around the outside. That recalls the same hallmark that you see on these Type 3 bars, and often these Type 3 bars have the date integrated into that seal. So that's kind of how you can tell the Type 3 bars. 1959 to the 1980s, larger silver bars seem to be the ones that most people were made, or most of these that were made. Now, this is, again, kind of a difficult area to study because there just aren't very many examples, and Ken has looked into this very deeply, and it has really not found that many resources that explain exactly why these bars were made. So again, I'm putting it out there that at least it's a possibility in that early series that these were kind of in a response. If you needed silver back, it wasn't fair that the government was going to give you 90%. They were going to give you back your pure silver, but it had to be stamped on it to show that you had participated in the government's rules, that you were playing by the rules. So I had been studying all of these, and I'd been keeping it in the back of my mind. Now, I hadn't really taken a deep dive. I'd perused these articles. I had kind of locked in my brain that there were different styles and different types. And here's that ABL that I was talking about, always be learning. I knew how to reference these, and I do a pretty good job of that. I can remember little bits and pieces about things, and I can reference them pretty easily. So with these Greece bars and the bars that came prior to them still on my mind, I happened to stop in a local shop about 2 weeks ago. And there on the counter were a couple of 3 silver bars from Silvertowne. Now, I had just done a video that Liberty Bleed Silver had kind of suggested that we do to show our greater than 1 troy ounce silver bars. And I showed a pretty nice selection of a lot of these that you see here. These are 10 ounce bars. And I showed some 5 ounce bar too. And at the time, I mentioned that I had 2 Silvertowne bars that I had bought from my first real coin dealer going back about 15 years ago, maybe even a little bit earlier than that. And I wasn't a big fan of Silvertowne for many reasons. They're a respectable company. They're a respectable name. It just wasn't something that ever really did anything for me. But he had these 2 kind of cool looking poured silver bars. And they were 5 ounce class bars. So I bought them, tucked them away, and kind of forgot about them until I was perusing allengelhard.com and realized that those 2 bars that I had bought from my dealer 15 years ago were scarce early bars from Silvertowne. They had made these in the early 1970s. So when I walked into my dealer's shop, they had 3 of them sitting on the counter, and I had that fresh in my mind, right? I had just shot that video. I had just been talking about it. I remembered looking at Silvertowne, ABL, right? And I flipped them over, and I saw that they had the correct verbiage, and they had the correct cooling lines, and they had the correct serial numbers of them. My dealer was kind enough to sell them to me, and they are part of my permanent collection. So now instead of 2, I've got 5 of these early Silvertowne bars. But there was one other bar in this group of bars. Now, somebody had brought in kind of an accumulation of silver bars. There was a mishmash of 1 ounce bars. They were kind of lesser name brand bars. There were these Silvertowne bars. But there was one other bar that I spied from across the room as soon as I walked in the door. And with that research still in my mind about having done looking at the silver bars that came before the Greece bars, this bar looks suspiciously like one of those. And I had never seen one of these before in the wild. In fact, I've never seen one of these online before I really started doing the research into these bars and looking at Ken Conaway's articles dating back to 2014. But I couldn't remember which style was which. I didn't know which type came first. To me, this was something that I had associated in my mind with being redeemed for silver certificates. So I had a pretty good idea that this was probably from the 1960s. This was a cool piece. My dealer was kind enough to sell this piece to me too. Grabbed it, went home, actually went on vacation for a few days, and didn't have a chance to really look into it. But I reread the articles that I'd found written by Ken Conaway about these silver bars, and I realized that this silver bar was not a Type 3 bar, and it wasn't a Type 2 bar. This silver bar looked like it was a Type 1 bar. That dates all the way back to the 1930s. Are you ready for it? Here's the big reveal. Here we go. This is that bar. Now, again, I had never seen one of these in my hands before. I was just going off of that learning that I had had when I was researching those grease bars and the bars that came first. So I dove headfirst into this, and for the last couple of days, I've been really trying to scour the internet for any information that I could find about these pieces to try to verify that it was one of the bars that I thought it was. Now, I actually reached out to Ken, and one of his articles had an old email account. So I reached out to him and I thought maybe there's a chance it's still active. This dates back, this is a 10-year-old article. And Ken was kind enough to respond to me. And we had an ongoing conversation for several days. And I really appreciate all the time that he spent, trying to guide me in the right directions and tell me what it was that I was looking at. But eventually, after sharing lots of photographs and discussions with him, Ken confirmed for me that this is I want to make sure that I've got this right, a Type 1 Series 2 silver bar, again, dating probably from the 1930s. This is a large font, and these are straight stem 9s. Let me get my little pointer. So we're talking about the large font here, the straight stems on the 9s. Ken has been able to look at enough of these bars to kind of make determinations between the various styles that were used in the various types. This is a Type 2, and we know that by the serial number. That's what identifies this as a Type 2. Sorry, let me back up a little bit. It is a Series 2 of the Type 1. So this is the earliest form of bars, but this one came a little bit later in that same series. And we know that by the serial number that's on the bar. So it's a Type 1 Series 2. Large font, straight 9s. It sounds very specific, but like I said, Ken has been researching these for decades. And he accumulated, or at least had some control over, probably the lion's share of all of these bars that are out there. Like I said, we don't know how many of these are made, but they were very scarce. And I believe that Ken's collection, at the height of his collection, was somewhere around 150 of these pieces, and that would have represented most of them. So that is fascinating, and I am blown away, and I am so excited to have this as part of my collection. Definitely part of my permanent collection. It's not going anywhere. This is probably my very finest silver bullion bar that I will ever own. Do you have one of these? Maybe you've got a handful of them. If so, you've got a heck of a collection, because this is truly a once-in-a-lifetime holy grail kind of find. This is exceptional. So how much is it worth, right? That's the question that I'm sure everybody's asking. This is kind of funny because I wasn't really concerned about its value. As I really learned more and more about this, I realized that this bar wasn't going anywhere. This is not for sale. This is going to be part of my permanent collection till the day that I die. So how much is it worth? Well, we know we have auction examples going back, probably about 20 years now. And I'll show an example of one of these. Back about 20 years ago, these were selling for $700, $800, $900 a piece. That's pretty amazing. That's a pretty good price. But I think that maybe the broader market was tamped down a little bit by the fact that Ken Conaway had so many of these. And I mean that in the nicest sense. When you have one strong collector of a series and that person has the lion's share of the pieces that are available, it kind of keeps other collectors away from that series. And I think that may have been the case. I think that may have been keeping prices low. So going back 20 years, maybe $700, $800. Then going a little bit further in the future, let's kick it forward somewhere around 10 years later, these were up to about a couple $1,000s a piece. And I think the market was really starting to respond to these, realizing just how scarce they were, just how few of them survived the mass meltings of the 1980s and later, and how few of them were still around. But then there was a sale that happened through Heritage in August of 2023, so just a few months ago, and these pieces were on fire. Now, it turns out that Ken had actually divested himself of most of his collection a few years ago. And I'm wondering if the market is finally starting to kind of respond to the availability of these pieces. Again, it's kind of one of those peculiar supply and demand things. Sometimes the fewer the pieces there are, the less the prices there are. But if there's enough to spur investor and collector interest, sometimes those prices can explode. And boy, did they explode. Take a look at some of these prices. So this was through Heritage Auctions, and this was literally just a few months ago. These bars are comparable to this bar. So what you're seeing now is how the market has responded. So did I hit a home run? Well, I hit a home run in the fact that this is a really, really cool bar. And like I said, it's going to be part of my permanent collection. But you have to ask yourself, is pent-up demand really an indicator of where prices are going to remain forever? In the collectibles market, there are so many examples of pieces hitting kind of peak prices when you've had deep pocket investors or collectors that are finally able to acquire pieces, and they have bidding wars over pieces. But then just a few months later, those same pieces can be found on the market for pennies on the dollar. That happens all the time. This is one of the reasons why I'm so concerned with the increasing price of gold and silver right now. I think a lot of people are getting into the market, seeing it at these highs, thinking that it's going to go on forever. But I've been doing this long enough to see those prices come right back down again, and that's what concerns me. The same thing could have happened with these silver bars, right? We don't know if these prices are sustainable. And frankly, they don't seem very realistic. Some of these prices seem outrageous. Doesn't really matter. This piece is part of the permanent collection. I'm not selling it. But it's nice to know that for at least a little while there is support under these pieces that seems to be pretty heavy. Now, there are super, super scarce varieties of these that also sold at that collection, and I'll put a link to the collection down below. It's fascinating enough that I think it's worth perusing if you want to. Heritage called it the Delta Ingot Collection. That was 8/17/23. So if you want to take a look at it, go through it. They were excessively rare pieces, pieces that predated the type 1, 2, and 3, pieces of larger sizes, pieces in stranger shapes. There were examples that had little mottos written on the back. I think one of these might have been one of the last bars that was made at the San Francisco facility. So you can see by these prices that some of the prices involved here were astronomical. That's not what this is, but it's clearly part of this same series. So you can see the prices right now are on fire. Will they sustain? Will they remain on fire? I kind of doubt it, but again, it doesn't really matter. So there we go, the big reveal. So we still have a lot of questions about these bars, right? What were they made for? What was the purpose? While I was researching those silver granules that I wanted to talk about in relation to those grease bars, I came across another article in Coin World. This was from August of 2014 that referenced a silver pack, and I think that this is probably an aftermarket little plastic case that had the same silver granules that you would have gotten if you turned in your silver certificates. But this article referenced author Ron Gillio of Stack's Bowers. I mentioned Stack's Bowers is one of the most important coin auction companies in the world in my recent video where I talked about CMQ grading. That's David Hall's and Stack Bowers' new grading service, stickering service. And I'll put a link to that video down below too. Ron had apparently redeemed hundreds of thousands of silver certificates in this period of time, right? So he was one of those people that was lining up to get these grease bars and whatever else he could get for his silver certificates. And I came across this quote from him in that article that I thought was really interesting. Small silver bars in various weights and stamped with the seal of the San Francisco Assay Office were paid in exchange for scrap silver for melting, but definitely not for silver certificate redemption. So that kind of removes the possibility that these were being used as redemption for silver certificates. Sure, it's possible that some of them were, but it seems unlikely that they were. So was Ron's reference kind of a reference to Executive Order 6814, right? Is this more support for the idea that people had turned in pure silver bullion who wanted to get pure silver bullion back, but wanted to be able to prove that they had participated in the government's program that allowed them to keep the silver bullion without having to keep on turning it back over and paying those outrageous, frankly, seniorage prices? They wanted something that was stamped with the hallmark of the United States government on it. I think that's a possibility, right? I think that's at least one suggestion that seems to make sense. It's plausible. Again, we just don't really know. I like to think that some of these bars might have been souvenirs. And I kind of proposed that when I really first began talking with Ken Conaway. And I think he kind of shot that down immediately. He's probably been studying these so long that he just discounted it. And I'm willing to accept his professional opinion, but hear me out. I think it's got some merit. This is a 5-ounce silver bar, right? That's a pretty small silver bar. What would this have been used for in industry, right? What would this have been used for in jewelry making? Well, we know that in the, I believe it was 1600s, so much silver was being pulled out of circulation in London to make silver mugs and silver plates and things like that, because the coinage was the same purity that these mugs and dinnerware pieces were made out of. It was all 92.5% sterling. So silversmiths would just melt down the silver coinage and make their silver mugs out of it. And the government realized that there were so few coins left in circulation that they mandated that silver that was made into useful articles had to be a higher purity of silver. That was called Britannia silver. So it was more pure than sterling silver. And it's much more difficult to refine silver than it is to add base metal to silver to bring down its purity. In other words, it's easier to start with a higher purity and bring it down than to start with a lower purity and try to bring it up. That's very problematic. That requires a lot more equipment. So I'm wondering if that had something to do with this as well, right? If you needed silver and the government said, well, here's some silver certificates, or we'll give you 90% silver coinage. But if you really needed pure silver, again, for scientific purposes, for investment purposes, for whatever reason, the government really seems to have had an obligation to pay you back in the same pure silver that you had turned in. So I'm wondering if that has something to do with it. But these sizes are so small. If you needed 5 ounces of silver and you didn't need it to be absolutely pure, you had silver coinage. That was right there. The San Francisco Mint had cranked out peace dollars in the same period of time. They would have been everywhere, or at least pretty easy to access if you were in San Francisco. So I wonder if this smaller size bars would have been used more as a souvenir. Now, if you were a businessman in the 1930s sitting at your oak desk, this would have made kind of a neat paperweight, right? I would probably have used it as a paperweight. Some of you may use a 10-ounce bar of silver now as a paperweight. It's kind of a neat thing to have on your desk. It's a neat pocket piece. It's a neat conversation starter. It doesn't seem like it would have much practical use if you wanted silver bullion. 5-ounce bars, a pretty small bar. We don't even really see 5-ounce bars anymore, right? We see silver coins, we see silver rounds, we see 10-ounce bars. That seems to be kind of the standard. So what is it? Is it possible that it was just used as a something as a paperweight, as a toy to play with for a businessman? It seems to make sense. But also keep in mind that San Francisco, located really, really close to the gold fields during the gold rush. So there has always been a strong connection with San Francisco and precious metals. That's why the San Francisco Mint was founded in the first place. And if you know that the San Francisco Mint, and I'll show you a picture of it here, it was called the Granite Lady. That was really kind of a marketing thing that was done back in the 1970s. Ironically, it's actually not built out of granite. But the San Francisco Mint, this is the second version of the Mint, but for all intents and purposes, this is what people think of when they think of the San Francisco Mint. It was actually one of the few buildings that was left standing after the 1906 earthquake and resulting fires. So this was one of the kind of features that people of San Francisco would have had pride in. They would have remembered it. And we're talking the 1930s to 1906. This is easily in somebody's lifetime. So somebody that survived the earthquake who had gone on to be a business person, for example, would clearly still have remembered the 1906 earthquake and the fact that this building still survived. And the Granite Lady was taken out of commission in the 1930s for another building. It was replaced in 1937. So again, I wonder if these smaller bars could have been a souvenir that somebody would have picked up to remind them of the original Granite Lady as this new mint came online. This smaller size, without much of a practical purpose, it seems to be at least a possibility, right? Is it worth entertaining? I don't know. But I will say also that we know that San Francisco was kind of a hotbed for numismatic souvenirs. And what I'm thinking about here are the California fractional gold pieces. Technically, this is the Series 2 pieces, and I'll show an example of what I'm talking about here. These pieces were originally made in the gold fields during the gold rush, 1849, 1850, somewhere in that period of time. And we have some evidence to suggest that these really tiny gold coins were actually circulated because there was no other form of small change, if you will. But as more and more tourists started coming to the West Coast from the East Coast, trains had kind of solidified, transportation was a lot easier than it had been. And people wanted to see the Golden Coast, and it was kind of almost a nostalgic thing. We know that a lot of these souvenir type gold pieces that mimicked the earlier pieces came out in the 1870s, 1880s, probably 1890s, some of them backdated to the gold rush, but this would have been kind of a 50-year celebratory commemoration souvenir for the people that were tourists of San Francisco at the time. I think a lot of them probably recognized that these weren't original gold pieces made during the gold rush, but it was an inexpensive, attractive, neat little keepsake that they could take back with them to the East Coast, kind of showing that they had been part of this California gold rush, if you want to. So there is evidence that we had numismatic souvenirs from this period of time, and I just kind of feel like this reminds me of that. Call me crazy. Let me know below what you think. Am I just being ridiculous, or do you think that there's any merit to the possibility? It just doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of practical purpose for a 5-ounce pure silver bar. It seems like it was almost more of a souvenir. Ken disagrees with me, by the way. He said specifically that he did not believe that these were done as a souvenir. But again, I think there's some merit to the idea that these bars, which we still don't really understand why they were made, I think having that seal on them from the mint, from the assay offices, from whatever organization made them, and they were made in Philadelphia, New York, Denver, New Orleans, San Francisco, that kind of proved that the silver had been part of this recall and had been, that you had participated in what you were supposed to do. What do you think? I am so thrilled, so stoked to have this as part of my permanent collection. I'm so glad that you came along with me on this journey. If you have one of these bars, we are now brothers in arms. If you don't have one of these bars, keep your eyes open for one of them. Like I said, always be learning. Let me know your thoughts down below. Let me know your thoughts about paying outrageous prices for what ultimately is just a block of silver. Is it something that you want? Do you disagree with? Do you agree with? If you've got questions about any of these things that we talked about here today, any of the silver bars, any of the rules and regulations, the laws, let me know. Leave a comment down below. Like I like to say, if you've got a question about something, there's a very good chance that somebody else does. Like to be able to answer everybody's questions if I've got the knowledge to be able to do so. And if you've got any other suggestions for videos or even video series you'd like to see me do on silver, gold, coins, bullion, anything else that's related to this, leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. And as always, and I mean this sincerely, guys, thank you for coming with me on this journey. And thank you for allowing me to be a part of your journey as we go deeper into the worlds of coins and physical precious metals.